Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm Joe Menn with Reuters. And I'm going to ask everybody to introduce themselves, but to start it off, I've been writing about cybersecurity and privacy for 20 years or so, and I've got an exciting new book coming out in June about the cult of the dead cow. One of the things I like about it is that it crosses a lot of issues from pure tech to social priorities to law and order. It covers a lot of stuff, and that's why I think this is such a fascinating intersection of areas. And we'll start it off with John and go down the row.
All right, I'm John Callas. I'm Senior Technology Fellow at the ACLU. I have done privacy and security for a long time. I was one of the co-founders of PGP, also Silent Circle and Blackphone, then CTO at Entrust. Worked several times at Apple and done a number of other standards, protocols, etc.
Hello everybody, my name is Kurt Opsahl. I'm the Deputy Executive Director and General Counsel at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. EFF is a nonprofit organization dedicated to defending your rights online. We fight for things like privacy, free speech, innovation, trying to make for a future that you would want to live in.
I'm Sara Terp, otherwise known as SJ, and I founded Bodacea Light Industries to work on misinformation, both the financially motivated misinformation with the Global Disinformation Index, and also power-motivated misinformation, which I generally work with the Special Forces Innovation Group Softworks on. And privacy, I've been working on data ethics and privacy. I started getting interested in that quite a few years ago when I was working on crisis mapping and noticed just how much data was held about people they didn't know was being held about them. So, next.
Hi, I'm Marc Rogers. I'm the Vice President of Cybersecurity Strategy at Okta. I'm also a white hat hacker who does a lot of research, hacking things like cars, buildings, phones, pretty much anything that comes across me, actually. And I'm also the head of security at DEF CON, so I get to see a lot of information being weaponized and a lot of the fun that ensues from that.
Great. So to start things off and sort of set the tone, I guess, this is a very interesting period because we have, I think, more awareness of privacy risks, and then a mad on the part of individuals, and then a mad rush on the part of companies to monetize everything they have about us via big data, AI, machine learning, what have you. And then we have regulation finally showing up in at least some parts of the world in various forms, including GDPR in Europe and a California privacy bill, and now actual talk about a federal bill in the US, which may or may not be a good idea, depending on where you stand. But I think it's sort of most interesting in the companies because they're sort of stuck in the middle, negotiating between newly aggravated users and on the one side and newly aggravated regulators on multiple other sides. As an example of that, we were just talking before the panel about a gentleman who used to be CTO of Mozilla. I believe he now works at Apple, is that right? Who was stopped at the airport coming back in the US. The Border Patrol immigration folks demanded access to his machinery, and he said, look, you know, there's secret code, proprietary code that hasn't been released. I'm not authorized to open this. And there was a huge standoff, and so the ACLU has just sued over this. I just think that's an interesting example of where things are going. This is a very sophisticated individual, former CTO of Mozilla, unsure of what his rights are in that circumstance, and I think most of us would be unsure of our rights in that circumstance. All right, so let's start off with sort of what sorts of things we have to be worried about in terms of privacy now, in terms of information. In the olden days, it seems, you know, your name, your social security number, a few other things, but now your gait and your retina and all these other things seem to be fair game to be worried about. How much more data is there on us that consumers should be worried about? I guess I'll leave that up. Whoever wants to jump in.
I guess I'm the data scientist, so an awful lot of data about you. And it's not just the data that's held about you, it's the data that can be generated about you. So we were talking also about deepfakes. So I can now take your voice for this panel exactly. The fact that we're speaking at this panel gives us enough data to fake my voice and put that against somebody else's face, make me say things I didn't. So privacy has got more complicated. The things that you think are private aren't anymore. There's so much tracking of, I'm holding a tracker right now. I can tell where I've been. There's examples like the bicycle data telling when people have been hooking up because you've got people taking bicycles from the same place from and to at the same time. It's not just the volume, it's the fact you can backtrace and you can remove the fact people's anonymity very easily. I'll stop talking, I'll let someone else talk.
I was going to say, it's interesting because there's two sides of the same coin. On the one hand, this information can be used to incredible power for security by looking at context. If you take all the additional contextual information about what someone's doing and then combine that with an authentication request, you can be really certain that the right person is doing the right thing for the right amount of time. But on the flip side, that information gets out and you know how to mimic and you know how to attack better. So that's one of the reasons why I'm going to be the kind of the negative Nelly about policy here. I think a lot of policy does offer great protection because it sets a baseline. But my fear is that the information world, the digital world, is moving so fast that most of the policy that gets created is so brittle that it breaks as many things as it protects. For example, if you look at GDPR is seen as very beneficial because of the granular controls it offers to users. You can finally opt out of things, you can request your access to your data, you can request it be deleted, but on the flip side, how do you authenticate those data requests? Because if the wrong person is able to request all of your data from an organization, that could be catastrophic. Those are self-induced breaches to some extent. And also, when you look at the security research space, security researchers collate large data sets of information because that's a very effective way to track bad guys and identify campaigns. But now there's a big question mark over this because if we're not allowed to retain things like IP addresses, we're not allowed to retain demographic information, all of these pieces, then how do we do this kind of correlation activity? And so I worry that if we layer too many rules and make things too rigid, we're going to hurt the good guys more than we'll hurt the bad guys.
Do either of you want to weigh in more on just on the privacy basics, different things that we should be concerned about getting collected before we go into more of the regulation pluses and minuses?
Well, I guess I'll speak to that a little bit. So should you be concerned? Sure. There's a lot more data about you that is being collected all of the time, though I think that we probably are unable to stop the amount of collection in an effective manner, and so we need to use tools to make it so that that causes less harm. That the power of massive data is becoming more realized, that things that are anonymized are easier and easier to de-anonymize, and by the nature of using phones, computers, IoT devices, more and more data is being collected. So how do you do that? I think it's a combination of things. I think there actually is quite a role for policy to make it such that the policy is not to misuse that, but you can't trust in policy alone to do the right thing. You also need technologies that will protect, to be effective at anonymizing data and as best it can. You also need legal systems that will put restrictions on, say, how the government can use this in the golden age of surveillance. And all of these things together are necessary in order to create a future in which the rise of the ability to gain information about people, store that information, use that stored information to go back in time and find out everything about somebody does not come to a dystopian nightmare.
I'm going to add in that I think that both policy and technology are useful, and they do different things. The technology, when you make it work, has the advantage that it's in general extraordinarily good at what it does. Policy, on the other hand, can be squishy, but there are places where it does a lot better than you would think on first blush. I think that a bunch of the rules that need to be in place are about what the disposition of data would be used, who are you going to give it to, sell it to, et cetera. That, for example, the security researchers that you're mentioning, Marc, are typically not going to be handing it out willy-nilly or, selling it to an ad company for profit. And so, we can push those off into a different category. Changing what people are doing, which is starting to happen because of GDPR and others, because it used to be that you would collect everything because storage was going down exponentially, so it might be useful tomorrow, and it costs next to nothing to keep it, so you probably should. And it's a very easy economic calculation to make. But now, if you're in a situation where you now have to say, well, what would be the probability that somebody would take that data and make it public, and then I would be liable to regulatory agencies, et cetera, that is the balance against it, and that is starting to get people to say, let's make sure that we only collect what we need, let's make sure that we have put some proper things in places. Retail level anonymization typically doesn't work very well, but doing things like aggregates does, and frequently what you really want is the aggregate, not anything else. So that's also something that a lot of people are doing because it's what you wanted anyway, and it's not going to hurt you.
Let me ask a little bit about the balance of power between governments and individuals. I'm thinking here of Tor and related privacy protecting technology that used to be really pretty complicated. Still is, I think, for most people. On the other hand, we have Signal and Signal going to WhatsApp, and suddenly many, many more people, perhaps 1 billion people or more, are protected with end-to-end encryption. So that seems like a good thing, the popularization of these more secure technologies. On the other hand, that has roused the fearsome beasts of even the Five Eyes, who are now yelling in public and probably in secret courts as well, that companies need to be able to hack or prevent their users from using such technology. How do you like our odds? Where is this headed?
So far, we have managed to keep a lid on what things are going, and I believe that we can continue to make these same sort of arguments that we've been making back. It's true that you are either designing for security or you're designing for surveillance. You don't get to do that, anything other than that. And if you build in surveillance-friendly things, they are going to be used. They're going to be used all over the world. We're seeing that right now with not only what state actors are doing, quasi-state actors like the NSO group. Just this week, there was Gavin de Becker's article that he put out in the Daily Beast, where he said that the Saudis went after Jim Bezos's personal information, and you either say free-for-all for repressive governments or you lock things down, and those are essentially the two choices.
I mean, I see this as a living room problem. I don't want people knowing what the chats I have in my living room are. I don't see WhatsApp being that different. But also as an individual, there are things you can do. Like very, really simple things like use your neighbor's address for your Uber. So some of this is personal OPSEC, and some of this is what is your level of threat, who is it you're trying to protect against?
So, add on to that. We've been fighting over encryption for quite a while, I think, and for a period of time, at least, seemed that there was a reasonable detente in which there was strong end-to-end encryption, but then the government became upset when that became more widespread. That in the 90s it was available, there was a big fight over this, but it ended up being not as frequently used, and then when things came along like iMessage being end-to-end by default, WhatsApp by default, Tor, Signal. The government said, okay, you know, we're going dark. This is a problem. And I think that is fundamentally sort of a wrong point of view. That they are actually in the golden age of surveillance. They are able to track and gain information about citizens in a way that was never possible before. In the 70s, they had these things called payphones. You can ask your parents. They were unable to get a wiretap on a payphone in a timely manner unless they already knew what payphone somebody was going to use. And so people had untappable conversations. Nevertheless, society survived and was able to conduct law enforcement. This is not sort of the first time that things have been difficult for law enforcement to be able to see. Really, the thing that it is preventing them from doing is not conducting law enforcement, not conducting national security operations, but doing mass surveillance, doing surveillance at a huge scale where they don't have prior suspicion, where they can't make the effort to target an individual. If a nation state decides that they want to target you, your end-to-end encryption is going to be a slight annoyance. But if they want to look at all of the conversations that go on in the country to find out who might be a bad person, or later, when they decide someone is a bad person, be able to go back and see everything that they had previously said, then end-to-end encryption makes that more difficult. But that would be a massive expansion of government powers, and I think that in order to attempt to achieve a closer balance to the relationship between citizens and government, as we have had in the past, to respect the Fourth Amendment, respect fundamental human rights as recognized around the world, of privacy and autonomy, we need to have widespread availability of end-to-end encryption.
So one of the challenges is that the security landscape doesn't stay still. I mean, everyone here knows this. But it's the same with the information landscape. And if you look at the fights that are going on around things like access to phones, access to communications data, these are hotspots in a massive and expanding landscape. And one of the challenges is if you go across from industry to industry, a lot of them are operating in silos. So if you look at the mobile phone industry, that is a very robust, well-developed industry which has its own ideas about privacy, its own ideas about information, how it should be handled and how to secure it, and has been through many iterations of securing problems that have cropped up. But if you shift to a completely different industry, let's say automotive, then it's completely a greenfield. It's totally open. Just this week there was some research done which I myself am actually pretty intimately familiar with, which is how much data does a Tesla motor car collect? And the answer is a hell of a lot of information. Those onboard computers are storing information about how you're using the car, where you're going with the car, how well you drive, how badly you drive, and there are no mechanisms currently for consumers to really wipe that information off of a car in the event of, say, an accident. So the information ends up sitting in junkyards or it ends up sitting in auction houses and is accessible. The same goes for a lot of other IoT devices. You know, if you told me 15 years ago that I'd have to be careful about disposing of my light bulb because it contains my wireless password, I'd have thought you were crazy. But that's the world we live in. And those areas are not getting the same level of scrutiny in terms of what happens to this information, how is this information secured. And even the legislation that we see at the moment is only just starting to touch onto those areas.
So I was just going to say, we're talking about the government, but it's not the only player. And you're just building on that. I work on misinformation. Anybody can play this game now. Mass surveillance is available. Mass surveillance data is available to other nation states, to non-state actors, to other groups. And it's pretty easy to get. It's pretty easy to use. So we need to think about that too.
Yeah, I think that the thing that we have not talked about is what the threat model is, because the threat model depends upon what you are rightly protecting against, and it advises everything else that you do. if signals intelligence is your threat, that's a very different thing than what happens with data smog, data sludge, etc. And I'm far more concerned about the data sludge. I'm far more concerned about some things than I am about anything else, like, you know, viewing patterns of web pages, which the advertisers all have, and is being done well, it's the entire industry. These are the things that I'm more concerned about than I am about law enforcement or anything else, because law enforcement and other people have rules, and we are more used to negotiating those even when things are not as we would want, than a totally unregulated, you have no idea what ended up in the junkyard situation, which in a lot of cases they're not even doing this intentionally, it's just happening.
Let's go a little deeper on that one, the data sludge being weaponized. It is, we were talking about political campaigns and things things that one did when one was 15 can suddenly become weaponized very, very quickly. My personal experience with this recently was Beto O'Rourke, having been in the cult of the dead cow. He wrote under a pseudonym when he was 15, and now suddenly that's maybe an issue in the primaries. Certainly the Republicans think it should be. Is this the beginning of an era where it's going to be impossible to hide embarrassing stuff from when you were 12, 13, 14, because everything is done online and it's all weaponizable? Is this how dystopian are we going to get here?
We've been saying this is a problem for the last 15 years. I mean, you know, we were saying this when Beto was 15. So I mean, it has always been a problem, and the fact that these things are still around is going to make it worse. But even in those days, one of the things that we said was, you know, what happens if you say things on social media, blah, blah, blah. And a comment was, well, if lots of people have done it and you're just another one, then it may not be that big a deal. And I think that we're seeing that specifically with Beto, where, you know, even the short stories that he wrote that could be turned into hand-wringing whatever, he had writers say, oh, come on, you should see the things that I wrote when I was 15. If it gets put within the proper context, then it isn't the issue that it would be ordinarily.
It seems like context can be the luxury of the rich, though. I mean, we don't get to decide. We can't compete with massive botnets, state-sponsored propaganda, how stuff gets presented that reaches people. So let's talk about misinformation more generally. You've been doing a lot of work on this. So where are we at now? If you're at the cutting edge of misinformation and fighting it, we're all doomed, right?
No, we're not all doomed. Oh. We just have a lot of work to do. So I'm actually two people on this. One is hunting down misinformation that has an address, that has a URL attached to it. So half of my time I'm looking for the types of misinformation pages that are done for money, that are done for advertising money. And generally you get groups of these put up. Generally they're just they'll put out anything that'll make people angry, that make people look. So that we can start tracking. There are ways we can go find that. There are ways we can reduce that using the same levers that they use. So if you start working with the ad tech companies and reducing down the visibility of these things, that's one way to deal with. The other half of me works on the large-scale campaigns. And this is perhaps one of the reasons why I talk about OPSEC quite a lot. So one of the things we've been working on is how we apply information security frameworks back onto misinformation, how we start joining up the responses that people have. Because there have been individual responses that have worked really well. For instance, Macron's campaign team built honeypots. They saw the problems that happened over in America with the emails. They built honeypot emails. They weren't caught the same way. So there were learnings, there were little pieces of response all over the place. It's just putting it all together. In terms of privacy within this. There are the issues that you mentioned in that on the hunting the URL base, now that the DNS records are anonymized, it's harder to relate because we tend to see sets of pages rather than individuals. It's harder to relate those sites to each other, not impossible. In terms of how people are hyper-targeted, until last year I was working at an ad tech firm from the inside working on misinformation and trying to get regulation starting to push through on misinformation and privacy there. And it would help a lot to have those regulations on targeting. It would help a lot to have, so backing up slightly, it hits in multiple ways. One of them is political adverts hyper-targeting people through the ad tech exchanges. So if you have regulations saying that if it's a political advert, it gets marked up. Data scientist hat on, you can do things like hunt for logos, yada yada. The other problem is that your viewing patterns put you in demographics. So there's a huge amount of demographic information. But I also, from within the ad tech industry, I saw the GDPR panic happen, where we had to do these massive cleanups of our data. So the good news is GDPR is actually helpful. Sorry. So we're not doomed. This is a very short answer to a very long, winding answer to your question.
All right, let's go to regulation a bit. GDPR, Marc's already weighed in as on, I guess, of being of two minds, but generally against. Do you think you're more against than for?
I'm not generally against. I think it's something that needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. I think policy has the power to be very good, and policy has the power to push the whole industry to move in one direction, whereas otherwise it's like herding cats. But the problem with policy is the amount of time it takes to create policy and get it out there. Things are moving so fast that unless the policy creators are smart and write that policy taking into account that it's going to be, after the fact that this comes out, then you end up with challenges. Or you end up with vagueness in policy that makes it incredibly squishy. If you look at the recent Australian Access and Assistance Bill to provide the ability to get signals out of opaque companies because they're using strong cryptography, they were very careful to say, we're not going to mandate that anyone backdoors their cryptography, but then they go on to basically say, we're not going to specify what kind of assistance you're going to give, but you're pretty much going to give any kind of assistance. So while they're not going to break the cryptography, they are going to talk about potentially putting backdoors or Trojans into the code. And that's potentially just as bad.
So Kurt, I wanted to ask you, so I think GDPR is going to be played out in a number of cases, right? There'll be the regulations, the law might be fairly vague, but then there'll be these test cases that are already in progress that are going to sort of help give better signposts. My sense is that you're more supportive of the effort in general because it's enshrining some rights that weren't there before. How do you see it playing out?
Well, so I can start by actually making sort of a distinguishing between policy and regulation. So a lot of the things that I appreciate about the GDPR are some of the policy goals it's trying to achieve, allowing for consumers to give and withdraw consent, making sure that it is affirmative consent, sort of pushing back against the ways in which somebody might, if you use this site, you agree, get consent, but rather you have to step in. So this very top-level view, it is putting forth a lot of transparency, consent, user choice controls in. And then the regulation aspect is then you take these policy ideas and you write them up in a sort of a massive document that has various rules, and then it has the recitals, which are some interpretive documents to those rules, and then you have the data protection authorities who will then further interpret those rules and make choices about when they will say that something is a violation or not a violation. And some of so I sort of mixed feelings about the GDPR. I think there's a lot of really good policy ideas that it's trying to achieve, and in some cases it does a reasonably good job of achieving them. In some cases I think that it has produced regulations to attempt to achieve them that have some unintended consequences. So one of the things we were talking about right before the panel was some of the security things, as Marc was mentioning, like that the policy goal of allowing people to get their information back from a company, to get, what do you know about me, give it to me. That seems like a good policy goal, but if you create a regulation in a manner that allows a third party to obtain that information, the problem isn't really with the policy, it's about with the implementation through the regulation. And one of the other policy goals of the GDPR was to regulate the big tech industry, to have a sort of pushback on their sort of massive data collection and knowing everything about EU citizens, well, actually anybody in the European Economic Area. But to the extent that some of its goal was to sort of curb the power of the big tech industry, it created a regulatory framework that is very difficult and expensive to comply with, which makes it actually difficult for newcomers to come along, come up with a compliant system because it's very expensive, while the established players do have very large compliance and regulatory regimes and are actually in a better spot for doing that. So again, there's like a policy and regulatory disconnect. Is it going to work? Well, I think we need to think of ways of trying to achieve these policy goals and without undermining them through the regulation. And the most challenging aspect of regulation is that it is at best the best regulation about the technology that is known or suspected at the time that it passed. And then like a day later, it is a day out of date, maybe not that big of a deal, and then so on. As it goes over time, it gets further out of date. We have seen this with a number of privacy-related laws, the Electronic Communications Privacy Act from 1986 here in the United States. It had a vision that email was a BBS, a bulletin board service. You would go there, download it to your machine, and so they built into that law this notion that if you didn't download an email from the server within 6 months, obviously you've abandoned it, you didn't care about it, and they reduced the privacy protections for that email because it made sense to them under that technology regime. Later we have things like Gmail, webmail of all sorts, where everybody just leaves it on the server indefinitely. So the technology changed, but the law remained what it was in 1986. And I think any regulation is going to have that problem over time. And so you say, okay, so the DPAs are trying to interpret that. And the GDPR, they tried. They made their best efforts at being a technology neutral. They tried to write up broad precepts, and then they use some sort of for example about particular technologies or particular concepts like anonymization. But I think this is the challenge moving forward, is for the DPAs to interpret that in a sensible way, and then it may also come time where they have to reinterpret it in a sensible way as the technology changes, and that's a hard job for regulators to do.
Okay, who's good to talk about California and the potential looming U.S. federal laws around privacy?
I can.
Go ahead.
So yes, I mean, California has a reasonably sweeping privacy law now. There has also been introduced a federal one. I don't particularly like the federal one myself because it puts a cap on what the states can do, and I think that we have seen a lot of social good come from places like California regulating air pollution and other things more strictly than the feds, and a federal law that says that puts a ceiling on what the states can do rather than a floor is not particularly a good idea. There are some other interesting laws that are around as well. For example, in Illinois, there is a biometric privacy law that is having some interesting consequences, and I think that it is, by and large, also a good thing despite the consequences of what it's doing, because those consequences, as I have seen them, are actually what it was intending to do. I can talk more, but we only have 9 minutes.
Anybody else on California specifically, what the state of it is now?
I'll add a few words to that. Is that, yeah, so California has a law. It is kind of a very strange way of making a law. I mean, already it's strange to see how laws are made. In this case, they passed a law knowing that that law was not going to be the law, but they had a deadline to pass something, or on pain of a proposition being put forth on the California ballot. And so they passed a law such that the proposition was withdrawn, and then they have since gone back to be amending that law, which will go into effect in January 1st, 2020. So that process is underway, and I think we're getting a better idea of what it looks like, though until January 1st, 2020, we won't be sure that we have the sort of the final form as they're amending various parts of it. But it is trying to be something which is like in spirit, similar to the GDPR, but more sort of customized to California and U.S. notions. And then on the federal law, yeah, I share John's concerns about the having it be a ceiling and not a floor. By comparison, the Electronic Communications Privacy Act did allow for states to have stronger protections. And the federal government realizes that it needs to do something. After things like the Cambridge Analytica scandal, after the GDPR, there has been just a tremendous pressure on Congress to do something about this problem. One of the things I find challenging about Congress is that sometimes this leads to the, well, we have to do something, this is something, and so therefore we have to do that. And I'm concerned that the something that they're going to come up with is not going to be an effective solution to the problems, may have unintended consequences, and its primary benefit will be that they had to do something and this was something. But we are a long way from that law passing, so we will see what ends up.
So you're worried they're going to ban high-capacity data storage?
We'll see what they do.
So I have to say, as a global citizen and as a technologist who's worked on projects that span many countries and multiple regulatory domains, it scares me when I see lots of different countries all coming up with slightly different interpretations on how they want to protect data and how they want to protect their citizens. Because when you then try to roll out a piece of technology that goes across many of those different domains, it becomes an absolute nightmare. You end up with so many different laws that you have to comply with. Finding common ground becomes really difficult. And that's a problem that we're going to have to think about. I think overall we need to evolve the way we look at all of these things. I mean, just consider that most of your highly sensitive, highly private data is still accessed through analog means. You know, in many cases, a signature on a piece of paper is sufficient to give access to your entire data archive. Or if you want to do banking, then they want a physical copy of a piece of paper with some numbers on it. Those things don't gel. And I think we need to start thinking kind of holistically rather than tactically.
So I want to leave time for questions. So just to bring us to that point, let's talk a little bit about data stewardship, how companies should behave with the information they have on their users, their consumers, their partners. Are there any sort of guiding philosophies besides chuck it if you're not using it or you're not going to use it?
Well, certainly the most secure you can be with data is to not have it, right? That is a very strong prevention against data loss. But of course, there's always going to be some data that remains. I think just an important point about that is what we want to incentivize for data stewardship is for people to adopt best practices to reduce the risk. And we often have a system where instead it is focused on if there is a breach, that being sort of sad about that breach. And in some sense, I think that if there are two companies, one of which does everything that one should do, best practices, has a great security team, is constantly innovating, and then they nevertheless have a data breach because security is hard. And then you have another company that has terrible security practices, leaves passwords in the clear, doesn't have two-factor and so on, but they don't have a data breach. And we say, okay, those guys are doing well. And that seems to be that it provides a poor incentive structure, and we want to make sure that people are doing what are the best practices and constantly innovating on those.
Yeah, I mean, just ask why you're collecting the data.
I would say that responsible data stewardship is something that every company should strive for. If you do it right, it's going to save you money. Not only does it reduce your risk, but it also reduces a lot of your operational overheads. By understanding what data you're collecting and where you're storing, you can manage it better. But that's not necessarily the easiest thing. From a consumer perspective, what I would say is, as consumers, we need to start voting with our feet. And we need to start endorsing the companies that have strong, clear data stewardship practices and moving away from the ones that don't so that they feel it in their wallets.
I agree with that. I mean, regulation is always difficult. In general, it is better that we don't have regulation because regulation ends up favoring the regulated. It becomes a barrier to entry for upstarts. So if you are an established player, it might be difficult to be regulated, but it also secures your position. And the reason that we're having it is that there have been abuses that are in place. And changing what's going on and making it so that you do have good data stewardship, you communicate that well. We are already starting to see some companies competing on privacy and data stewardship, and that's a good thing to see because that's better than having the regulation.
All right. With that, we've got 2.5 minutes for questions. I see a roving mic, so if you raise your hand, she'll come find you.
I'm going to steal the mic first for 1 sec. We actually have some time with these panelists afterwards. So if you know the theater in the expo hall, you walk into the expo hall, it's on the left. There's a bunch of white cushions. All of these folks will be available for more Q&A. So we'll take a couple now, but if you have more, head down there afterwards.
Hi, Seth Rosenblatt from the Parallax. I was hoping you guys could talk about the role that technology can play in keeping privacy accessible so that we don't wind up with privacy elitism and privacy as an option only for the wealthy.
I mean, yes, that is something that we need to do to build it into everything. And that is something that a good company ought to be doing. Generating that, causing that would be done by voting with your feet, voting with your dollars.
It's also education. I mean, I've just been offered a cleaning pack. That costs money, but I didn't know that existed. Other people won't. Just making that visible would help.